Hello, and thank you for joining us for a discussion on streamlining the management of multiple websites and apps. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with Platform SH. This webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, and after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the lead dev Slack and answer some of your questions in the Building Software channel. So let's get started with some introductions. I will be your moderator, Jackie Balzer. I'm a senior engineering manager at Spotify, leading the teams who are building our podcast and talk audio experiences. Before Spotify, I led the front-end engineering team, building the world's leading platform for showcasing and discovering creative work at Behance and through the acquisition by Adobe. I've spoken at tech conferences worldwide. I've worked on engineering teams from small startups to massive enterprises, and I really enjoy empowering individuals and teams to build high quality and impactful solutions and user experiences. And today I am joined by Betty Lamb. So Betty is an engineer at Bloomberg, where she leads the marketing, engineering, and public cloud engineering teams. She thrives on managing high-performing teams and delivering on everyday business goals, as well as high-stakes projects. And she is based in New York and has been honing her skills to master the one-pot pressure cooker lockdown dinner. Next, we have Peter Scheipel. So Peter brings 15 years experience in the industry of building and managing digital services and products. As entrepreneur, having founded, built, and managed 2 startups, his passion is the intersection of implementing architectural concepts in the context of business requirements with a strong emphasis on understanding IT, also people business. Peter's position as Chief Technology Officer at Courier gives him the unique opportunity to establish an innovation and change-driven perspective, also in a corporate context, driving and evolving multiple partly interconnected platforms. Literature, music, time in the outdoors with his dog, but also topics related to sustainability and circular economy make up most of Peter's free time. And of course, we have Robert Douglas. So he is the author of the first book published about Drupal titled Building Online Communities in Drupal, WordPress, PHP, BB. He is a core code contributor to 4 different Drupal versions and the original author of the Memcache and Solar modules for Drupal. He has also served as a member of the Drupal Association, a founding member of the German Drupal Association, and a member of the Drupal security team. As a cloud hosting specialist, he designed the server architecture for hundreds of high-profile sites and is currently the Chief DevRel Officer for Platform SH. Beyond technology, Robert works as a record producer, photographer, and is frequently a speaker advocating for free software and free culture ideals in the music industry. So, welcome panelists, and welcome to everyone tuning in today. Let's dive right in. So, as organizations scale, they make more websites, more apps and products, and as this number grows, so do the challenges. Teams are faced with websites and apps maybe they haven't designed, that are built in different languages, and all of which come with their unique considerations. What that means, of course, is that these challenges can vary greatly, and the needs and setup of multi-site management can look different from company to company. So let's start by painting a picture. What's the situation that each of you work with in your day-to-day? Peter, would you like to go first?
Sure. So at Courier, we do pretty much what you just said. We have a multitude of platforms that we call verticals that run between, 300K page visits per month up to, millions. We have different sort of apps. We have all sorts of, in-house and external services we provide both to our colleagues and to our customers. And we do this through all sorts of different teams. Also, our corporate setup is in such a way that we're distributed not only geographically, but also in companies. So you could say it's a pretty heterogeneous landscape, but as you said, this comes with the time. The challenges are that we don't have the luxury anymore to have one single CMS or one single way we have developed apps. There's things that are acquired, things that are sold, things that are newly developed, legacy stuff. So it's all sorts of interesting situations we find ourselves in.
Very nice. Betty, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yeah, the context in which we work in Bloomberg is not too different from what Peter described. As you can imagine, there's a lot of different needs across the company. I guess specifically within the scope of marketing engineering alone, we've got about a portfolio of well over 100 different websites, ranging in complexity. Custom CMSs, and with that, the day-to-day is like we receive like a bunch of enhancement requests. There's bug fixes, requests to port features from one site to another. Less frequent, but it also happens is like being asked to bring in a site developed by another vendor, by an outside vendor, try to make that fit into our environment as well. And so with that, they each have like different traffic patterns, so also different infrastructure needs and upgrades that come with it as well.
Excellent. Definitely sounding complex. Robert, how about you?
Yeah, at Platform SH, we actually see this problem from both sides. First of all, we see it from our customers, many of whom have small or large fleets of websites or web applications that they develop and manage. We also see the problem from our own point of view, given that just to make our own business run properly, we also manage a fleet of websites and applications. And that can be anything from e-commerce transactional sites to statically generated content sites to forms to collect data, to chat bots that are written in Python to interact with Slack, to integrations. And therefore, we both feel this problem firsthand, and also in the way that we enable our customers to deal with their large numbers of sites, with the development workflows, the deployment workflows, and the governance that goes along with that.
Yeah, super interesting to have both perspectives. So on that note, now that we have a bit of a sense of the differences, what are some of the most significant challenges that your team has experienced when managing the growth of a fleet of applications, the websites, and the people needed to manage them? Betty, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. Well, I mean, it seems it's definitely a lot, right? Quite a lot of challenges, a lot of different aspects to it, and to me, these are good problems to have. That means there's a lot of demand. There's a lot of interest in the team, and generating more, which speaks to just that business validation. I think the first one that comes to mind is like you simply can't scale the team. That becomes like the first thing that kind of hits you, and different inflection points. You're never going to get one developer per site, and you're never going to be able to hire as quickly as you'd like. That's just the reality of it. You also get to a point where you find that your developers start to step on each other's toes, like if you're not investing properly in the dev tools and in baking in a process. I think some of the other challenges that come to mind are like, how do you balance that need for bespoke development with maintainability? Right. How do you keep the engineers motivated? Because you want them to continue to look at new ways of doing things, look at new patterns, look at new products. You don't want to stifle that creativity on the team, but you also don't want to get caught up into like a years-long project where you're building yet another CMS. I think if you've been in the industry long enough, you kind of get into that mode and you're like, oh, that's another one, right? So how do you balance the product needs? That's the other thing. Like, from the product perspective, sure, they want a lot of public-facing things, a lot of usable, things for their clients, but what are their other needs? And one thing that I've picked up on is, well, they also are in the role of training their users, their content editors. So we have to be, really mindful of that as we're developing and as we're, making selections on technologies. And I think the aha moment for me was when I realized like, we really can't, we have to pivot our thinking of ourselves as a team that develops websites, but and really think about focusing our team as the one that's developing these self-service tools for the business, because and really instead engineering should be pulled in for the bespoke development, that last mile of taking a site live, for example.
Yeah, interesting. It's a really interesting point about changing that mindset, because that in and of itself can be a challenge. Peter, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I can, at the risk of making this monotonous, but I can only agree with Betty. also on this point, it's I think it's very interesting when you go from as Betty said, like building something for the purpose of what it's supposed to be, and then take the next step into trying to come up with a tool set or like a box of magical tricks to, you know, make all sorts of different things, but keep them as homogeneous and as maintainable as possible. Because as Betty said, and we see the same thing. I mean, certainly on a different scale than Bloomberg, but it's still in its core. It's the same thing. We basically try to make sure that we can stay competitive on the market, because obviously, you know, you can hammer together a website or an app in you know, in weeks if you're clever, and probably, you know, make a website, make an app that's very competitive. Something that we sometimes struggle with, and that's why we try to you know, have this tool set that enables us to, you know, also react to the ideas from inside, to try something new and react to a trend and try to do something different. Yet at the same time, as Betty said, we have just so many people, and they can just learn so many languages and learn so many frameworks. And I think also one thing you see when you scale is, at some time you find yourself in this giant landscape of languages, frameworks, CMSs, infrastructure, components, and it becomes a mess at some point. And you need to standardize and you need to formalize things. And then you get to this friction point that Betty mentioned, between making it maintainable, making it efficient, making it economic for the business on the one hand, but staying flexible, staying competitive on the market, and staying interesting also on the other hand, especially if you're a media corporation, as Betty said. I mean, we have, you know, tons of different things. They all have different use cases. They all have different requirements. They all wish for different things. But at the end, you know, if something goes offline, if you get hacked, if you know, all those other things, then it's always like, you know, why didn't we take care of that? Why didn't nobody look into this? So you're always at this like friction point between, let's get it out the door, let's make sure it's safe and secure, let's make sure it's flexible yet maintainable. So it's, you know, you're always in this point of friction.
Yeah, interesting. How about you, Robert? What are some of the most significant challenges your team has faced?
Well, I just wanted to say that when I hear Betty and Peter sharing their experiences, it all sounds so familiar. And what I've seen through my work at Platform SH, where many of our customers run fleets of websites as Bloomberg or Courier do, the top level challenges like scaling the team, industrialization of the process, governance, et cetera, those remain the same. Those challenges all remain the same, but the devil is in the detail. And you have to look for every single organization what that detail is. What are the exact technologies being used? What is the composition of the team and how are they distributed? What are the governance and compliance challenges? Are you in a regulated industry or not? So what we've done at Platform SH in all of these cases is to try to provide a tool set that does that standardization and providing the same sets of tools and capabilities for all teams on all of the technologies, no matter what the compliance or regulation landscape is, so that there's this one point where everything's standardized for these top level needs, but all those devil details below, they can be dealt with as they need to be. So if you need Java developers, sure, bring Java developers on, but the tooling remains the same. It doesn't matter if it's a PHP app or a Java app. You've got the same pipeline, the same process. And if you have a team member who switches between, they'll find all of that familiar. Furthermore, so I think that there's a lot of cases where organizations that have large numbers of websites, they have an inherent conflict between this urge to move fast and be flexible, but also to have control. And this goes hand in hand with the scalability problem of the people. And some organizations decide to build that people problem out internally with internal teams. And some organizations decide to externalize that through agencies or external teams, especially multinationals do that. They ended up with like local development presences in various countries and various regions. And at that point, the standardization becomes especially critical because you want to be able to hand over the control of the creative elements and the velocity of development to the local team, but you also want to have that guarantee of quality assurance before you bring their work back into the fold and make it part of your website portfolio. So those are the types of problems that we like to focus on at Platform SH when talking about these fleet management situations.
And maybe if I can add on to that, I'm just real quick. I think one thing that's also really like a core issue when you run at scale is the thing that Robert said is it's not only flexibility versus standardization, but it's also what Betty called like the last mile. Like when we want something standardized. So I tell you, I need a node service or I need a, MySQL database. I don't care how it's set, but how it's run the bare metal, just do it. But at some points, we might get into situations that are so specific that I want to be able to say, look, we need, I'm just saying a random example, we need node version 10.4.3 release candidate 2 because that's exactly what we need. So I think that's also the challenge that companies like Roberts, but also we face, that we have those 80% that are very generic and very standardized and very fleet. But at some points we need that extra, like that last mile that Betty said. And I think that's also an additional challenge to this whole complex system we already manage.
Yeah, so let's go deeper on that. I think standardization is something that you've all just talked about the importance of, but how do you actually enable and scale innovation and flexibility and speed, time to market, without sacrificing standardization? I mean, how do you make sure these different products and services can stay individual but flexible with a standard tool set? Robert, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So again, I find myself more in the position of making recommendations on this than actually implementing them. So I'll give you some of the recommendations that I tend to give. First of all, standardization is more about how you're going to manage the exceptions than anything else. That's the last mile problem that we just discussed, right? There will be exceptions, expect them, and focus your efforts on planning towards how you're going to track and manage the exceptions. The standardization part is not the hard thing. Let's take Betty's case. I think you manage a fleet of WordPress sites. So standardization recipe for WordPress sites. First of all, consider yourself to be a software vendor and build a prototype.
Just real quick, it's custom CMS. It's actually highly customized. We use open source software.
We'll call it custom CMS.
Yeah. Yes.
So take your custom CMS and build a prototype of it, the one that you think represents the best practices that you would like to percolate down into all of the business units that you're dealing with, and really treat the release cycle of that as a software product that everybody has to subscribe to. Then find a way to be able to push those changes out to all of the people who are using it, but then give them the right parameters in which to customize that custom CMS even further, but retain a way to audit the changes in case they outstep their bounds. And what I think the best way to do that is through the magic combination of Git and like Git ops. So, always deploy using Git and no other way, and using the package manager artifacts, like in your case, composer lock files, to be able to audit what your teams are doing and to really, standardize on using the software distribution that you're providing, pushing out to all the sites, but be able to go and audit their composer lock files to see if they're adding anything that they shouldn't be.
Yeah, super interesting. Betty, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, sure. I think even, Yeah, I guess I would bring it up, just one level in the sense of, for sure there are, having a same deployment process helps, right? Having, but I think it even starts from setting the expectations across the team of like, what it is, the team needs to understand that whatever it is that we do is a shared responsibility. And that means that like, if you're going to choose something, whether it's bringing in a library, regardless of how you're customizing CMS and whichever CMS you're using, whatever you implement, somebody's going to be on call, and that person could be you. And I think just starting from that perspective, it kind of forces, it instills that culture of like, all right, so what do we need to do to make sure that we're all in a position to maintain these sites, right? With the variety and the complexity and the different tools and all of that. To me, that sets the tone to allow these open discussions around introducing new tools and languages, because I think inevitably, people are going to bring them up. There's the new trendy thing, like Peter mentioned, there's all these things we have to balance. And the way it's manifested itself in my team is that, what it prompts us to really use the RFC process, which I know that's been a topic of conversation at previous like lead dev conferences. But it really, works really well because it allows people to, really formalize the case, really allows for opening that discussion of like, what's the case for bringing this tool in? What's the impact of it? And then we can actually decide as a team and openly talk about that decision-making process. So then everyone's on board, even if you disagree and ultimately we decide, why. I think that sets the tone so that, then it leads itself to decisions where people are trying to minimize variations in infrastructure. So rather than having to go down to the individual, dependency files and figure out, I think that's definitely a great way to do it. But I often find that like, we probably don't have the cycles to build that, that kind of, auditing and governance tools around it. And so I want to make sure I capture it at the beginning. So at least to set that tone in the team, set that culture. And then people understand too, that like, okay, we're not just trying to focus on like, saying no to specific languages because of this, right? Or tools because of that. And then I think, there's the RFC process, but also there's, the whole development workflow with like Git, and you have to make sure that, there's multiple reviewers, and, we set that expectation on the team too. Large features, you want X number of reviewers, right? And, you've got a whole like, promotion process for your features and who's reviewing. And I think that's where Agile comes in together as well.
Yeah, nice. I think also like you sort of emphasize the importance of like communication and collaboration. So it's very much like a people aspect to this. We can tend to think a lot in terms of the tools or specific systems, but in the end, there are all people involved too. Peter, how do you enable and scale innovation on your teams?
Yeah, I mean, Betty said a lot of completely right things again. It's what you said in the beginning. I think I see large scale organization management or fleet management as the intersection between proper technical architecture and what you said, people business. Because I think when people think about standardization and formalization, they think about like pages of documentation and very rigid processes that they need to follow. And that basically chokes your innovation, as we all know, immediately, and makes you very unflexible to react to changes and all that. And I think, what has proven successful for us is that we don't try, as Betty said, we don't try to push technology onto people, but we try to, at the core of Agile, there's responsibility. We try to make this clear. We try to make clear that responsibility is not in the formal sense that you can't decide anything, but if it goes wrong, I'll come after you. It's really, you decide what language, you decide what framework. Obviously, there's like core principles and core processes. As Robert said, there's Git, and then there's continuous deployment and so on and so forth. But I think really at the core lies the understanding that we as a team were responsible for it. And as Betty said, it could be me who's the next one deploying this, because I think this really ensures that people take responsibility, they take ownership, and then they make the right decisions. Because I think this question of should we go for C# or should we do Angular or whatever, this is like a very top-down process that in my experience doesn't work. And what we are successful with is that we say, look, you guys are responsible for this product. This product needs to do this and that thing, and it needs to, you know, deliver this and that result. And that's it, you know. And if that's an Angular app, a React app, or whatever, it doesn't matter. And I think the second point is we try to hire engineers. We try to hire people who have common sense, who know their trade, and who don't really make a difference between, you know, Java, PHP, Scala, whatever. Obviously, you know, you're familiar with the language and the framework and whatnot, but we try to encourage them to think in problems and solutions, and to think in responsibility and results, and not in terms of I'm a Java guy and I'm an Apple guy, and you know, stuff like that. Because in the end, that's not how you deliver results. That's how you at some point stop evolving and become rigid and then stop innovating. And that's where you start failing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I totally agree with Peter on that too as well. And sorry, Jackie, just one quick add. I think the other thing is like to have that open discussion of like which part of the stack is it really worth customizing? You know, which is the part of the stack that we really want to introduce more variations? You know, is it more, do we have more, is it more on the rendering side, or do we really want to, you know, focus more on the authoring side? I think it's important to just openly talk about that, so that people realize that, you know, not to like suppress or to say like, oh, that's not a good idea, but like people need to understand like, well, why would that be worthwhile, right? Are we, if and I think it's important for engineering and product to be part of that rationalization process, you know, so because it does drive the priorities ultimately.
And maybe if I just can add one more thing to that, it's, I think when Betty says people need to realize, I think it's exactly what she said. It's not about the engineering team, and it's not about the engineering team and the product team. I think that, you know, every media publisher is an IT company to some sorts. And I mean, if you take the example of Domino's, Domino's said, like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, they don't make pizza. I mean, they're an IT company, and one of the products they do is pizza, you know? And I think that's how you also ultimately need to think about, not that every company is an IT company, but when you're in a media publisher, marketing needs to understand that, and management needs to understand that, and stakeholders need to understand that that's how stuff works in the 21st century. And they all need to be involved into this process, because I think that over the years, engineering had this like notion to push people out of the process because, you know, they make problems. And I think you should do the exact opposite. Our experience is that if you get editors and marketing and decision makers much closer to your process, they much better understand the process, and then they can much better facilitate the process. And it's what Betty said, you know, if you have everybody on board, then also they can take responsibility, understand, okay, so we can have, you know, something that's very standardized, so we get it out the door very quickly, but then it's probably less flexible, or we want something super customizable. Okay, so then it takes a little longer, and we need a couple more people on that, because ultimately this will make your decisions much easier, and therefore your process much more fluent and much less, you know, much less frictionable.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And actually that could be a good one to go into next. I think it's probably not an uncommon challenge for engineers to be able to collaborate outside of the engineering function. So what are some like key practices that you've actually particularly found successful to enable individuals to collaborate across the products and competencies? Betty, do you want to kick that off?
Sure. Yeah, it's, you know, want to make it feel as organic as possible, of course, in that collaboration. But I'm trying to think of, I mean, I referred earlier to like, there's the RFC process and the peer reviews. I think that, you know, that just increases a lot of communication across the dev team itself. I think it's also important to, you know, I think it's important to also talk about like, what's the tech stack that that we want to have. Like, so for example, like, let's say if you're trying to, are you trying to minimize the number of CMSs that you're using? Are we all, putting a stake in the ground and saying we're a jQuery shop versus or we a vanilla JS shop? I think that helps to just make sure that, like, narrow down some of the choices. And so it allows people to be able to go from, working on a specific set of sites to a different set of sites, regardless of the complexity, because then they don't feel like they're picking up something, that's completely foreign to them. I think that's one way to just narrowing down the tooling and the frameworks that people are going to be, that are common across these sites, allows people to just more quickly move between one and the other. I think the other thing is, having showcases at the end of each sprint, for example, like, it just helps people to just increase that, again, to see things that were built. You may not know that the person 2 rows next to you was working on that one thing, even though you hear about it every day at stand up. Like, what does that really mean? And then it sparks some interest, and then you get that conversation going to help collaborate. I think that's within within the scope of engineering, like, to work on across the the portfolio. That's one thing I can think of. A couple things I can think of.
Yeah, great idea. Robert, anything that's worked well for you to get people collaborating across the products and competencies?
I think there are 2 components that are worth mentioning. One is the ability to play and to experiment without friction, without roadblocks. And by that, I mean, let's take a couple of examples. Maybe your project is using Solr, but you've heard great things about Elasticsearch. How easily can you play with Elasticsearch? Can you do it with an exact copy of the application with relatively accurate data? Is it hard for you to set up? And then once you've done that, if you've successfully played with Elasticsearch and it's validated itself and you've decided that you'd like to do an RFC and say, hey, let's use this instead of Solr, it's got some advantages. And I'm not advocating here, I'm just using an example. Then how easy is it for you to share what you've done? So, and to bring people on. And the way that we approach both of those things at Platform SH is through the concept of self-service when it comes to starting like a new copy of your project or your application. Basically, we've reduced it to the point where if you create a Git branch, you get a complete copy of the application to begin with, but it's isolated from everything else. So you can play with it. There's no risk in playing with it. You can knock out Solr, add Elasticsearch, and see if it works, see how it is. And then once you've got it, if you can take the URL, send it to the stakeholders or your colleagues, or invite them in easily to the project and have them collaborate in a process that they know and understand and they don't have a lot of setup to do, then the collaboration goes way up. So one thing that we've observed in organizations that adopt these practices and these tools is that like the context switching becomes a lot faster. I'm able to quickly switch into like, let's try Elasticsearch mode and go through all of that work and the process of trying it out and sharing it with colleagues and getting feedback, and then either merging that or not merging that into your main work branch. Without losing the context of anything else that you might be doing, because the setup of that environment is so fast, and sharing it.
Nice, really interesting. How about you, Peter?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both what Betty and Robert said for us too. And I think to some extent, engineering teams are probably, we were the ones introducing agile and let's not have deadlines and let's not have roadmaps and just go as we go. But I think also we have been for a long time very prone to this waterfall thing, because what Robert basically says is a lot of engineering teams, at least to my experience, they talk about agile, but then in the end you have like a local environment, you have a development environment, you have a staging environment, you have production, and then you follow this path. And that's the holy grail of deployment. But as Robert said, you maybe want to try out something. You maybe want to crush your database, ruin the whole Elasticsearch index with something, and I think at the core of Agile is exactly what Robert said, and that's also what we do. Like every Git branch immediately triggers automatically a deployment that spins off its own feature environment, that copies the database, copies all the assets, takes everything with you, and you can, exactly like Robert said, send a link to marketing, send a link to the shareholders, and said, look, I tried this thing out, think about it or look at it. And I think one more aspect I want to bring in there is, like, I think one of the core things that also engineering needs to have in order to have this work is communication. I think communication is at the core of making things successful, because my experience is that the engineering teams sometimes tend to work on their own things and then hush hush, and then we give it to you and then you do whatever you do. I think it's very important that when you do this, you also communicate like, hey, we're trying something here. I'm sending you something that's not finished, it's not production ready, it's just like a proof of concept, and in another 2 months this could go out the door and it could actually work, and we're happy about it. So I think it's this combination of what Betty and Robert said of making sure all the base processes are there, so you can create on top of that and be flexible on top of that, but also make sure that everybody stays involved, even in uncertain and volatile things. I think that's the most important thing, to be an upfront communicator, to make sure what are we trying to do is probably, we're not sure about it, we don't know where this goes, but we want to be there in this, especially when something comes new to the market, when something is innovative, we just want to try stuff out without, being unsure whether this is then like, oh yeah, we love this, push this to production next week.
Yeah, cool. I like that. It sounds like there's a common theme of sort of maybe almost sandboxed safe spaces for experimentation, which is super interesting.
You should write this down and sell it on a t-shirt.
Yeah, I can't emphasize Peter's point enough, because I think it's, I found that where the experiments have worked best is when we're openly having that discussion with product and design, and then they actually are really helpful in providing and helping us look for those opportunities on when we're going to be kind of going off the beaten path, right, with those things. Because I think the last thing they want is for us to kind of slip in something brand new into what they expect to be like a typical development cycle, typical rollout of a product, and so that element of surprise is I've seen has not worked well, but but discussing with them openly is great, because then they actually have there's a lot more context sometimes behind what's being asked, and they can actually say, you know what, that thing is more of an internally driven deadline, this is just one product where we can actually have much more wiggle room. We might not always get that perspective on the engineering side, so it doesn't hurt to open up those discussions, and also with design, like you just get a lot of really good collaboration when you involve these, all the 3 teams when you're trying to experiment.
Yeah, nice. So given we've talked a lot about the importance of standardization, as well as the importance of like flexibility and experimentation, how do you make sure that your fleets and fleet management doesn't slow you down? Like, when is the right time, or when is too soon to build in your fleet management best practices and processes? Peter, do you want to go?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that if you safely can answer this and you have a recipe for that, you should definitely write a book and become very rich. I mean, what I've experienced is a couple of the things that I've already said are like telltales of you're on this brink of change. I think when you start seeing all sorts of technologies, frameworks, and tool sets, that's usually a very good indicator that you need more standardization, because your growth kind of pushes you into this position of having a lot on your portfolio, with the requirement to streamline your tool set, let's say. I think that's one very good telltale. On the people side, I think what I often see is what we already talked about. When you don't necessarily know who's responsible for stuff. It's usually a very good sign that there's lots of people involved on things, but the structure to support this is kind of missing. Yeah, I think there's like for sure a couple of them, but for me those were the most telling ones that, you know, if things starts to grow apart and starts to become complex and starts to become hard to understand, both technically and on the people side, you're usually in the, let's say, fortunate position to be successful enough to, you know, grow and become bigger and more successful, but at the same time in the need of streamlining, of standardizing, of formalizing. And I think you can very easily pick up on that. And also there, I think communication is important to also see this early enough, because I think that the less you communicate, the longer this stays under the hood. And I think also to really encourage people to speak up about this, because the larger you grow, the easier it is that somebody thinks like, wow, this is like the 1750th time that I'm installing the same software on the same kind of a server. You need to give these people also the possibility to say, hey, you know, here's a problem, we should look at this.
Yeah, nice. Robert, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's actually a fascinating question, and I've been like racking my brain for the best answer the whole time I was listening to Peter, and I think it for me comes down to know where to spend your time so that you're actually adding business value. And the example that I have to back that up is a quintessential scenario that I see when I come into a new organization and start to ask them how they do things. And I often have a conversation that goes something like this. Oh, here, meet Jimmy. He's a developer. He sets up our servers. And I'm like, that's interesting. Development to me means actually writing application code that would go into your product. Why is Jimmy setting up servers? And they explained that it's very important for them to control the way that it's set up so that their application runs correctly. And my goal then becomes to show them that Jimmy should actually go back to writing application code, and that by standardizing setting up servers or whatever else, you know, Jimmy might have been doing DevOps wise or sysadmin wise, and maybe making a decision like outsourcing some of that to somebody who's a professional at it, can free up the resource, you know, for them to actually add value to the business product instead of wasting their time, so to speak. And that, in effect, is also the first step towards preparing your fleet. Because if you then standardize what Jimmy's been doing, then Jimmy is no longer a bottleneck that prevents you from launching 100 sites next week instead of one site.
That's a great point. Betty, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way Peter described it probably reflects more like my experience with figuring out, like, you know, when it would be, you know, I guess when the inflection, you know, when do you decide, right? Or when you've reached that point. But I think, you know, but Robert's point around the bottlenecks, I think that's a very telling moment, right? It's definitely a very tough question to answer scientifically, because it's like, you just really don't know. And oftentimes you don't figure it out until it's too late. And you've had those bottlenecks, and then you kind of feel like you're, you know, trying to catch a running train, because you're trying to figure out, like, how do I deliver while I'm trying to solve this bottleneck? Oh my gosh, you know, these are, you know, we've reached that point. So it's tough. I think if you have the hindsight, you know, up front, then great. You know, you can, you know what staffing to ask for, and you know that you need to, like, really solidify around, you know, having the proper, you know, infrastructure patterns and deployment patterns. But I think most likely the reality is you're starting off, and, you know, and the folks you're dealing with and you're trying to deliver value to are trying to assess, like, well, how valuable is this, right? And so you really just don't know, and, you know, how big, you know, this is going to grow, you know, how big that platform is going to be used. So it's tough. It really is. It's I think you just kind of learn by, you might hit a wall a couple times and, you know, have that panic moment. And then you know, and then you retrench and you try again. But
And if
Yeah.
I maybe one quick thing to add, I think communication in this regard is again very, very important, because I think that if management communicates to you very clearly what's the strategy, what are the milestones, what are the long-term goals, I think this is much less likely to happen. So I think another telltale sign is if in engineering you have no idea where the journey goes, because then it's very, very easily you fall into this trap, like, let's build something, we think it will go this direction, so we'll prepare for this stuff. Then management comes along, says, no, 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 we need this. You didn't prepare for that. And then you start trying to catch that train that Betty mentioned, I think.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. So we're just about time, but I thought maybe we'd do a rapid fire round of a final question to end on sort of a more fun note. Betty, you mentioned a moment of panic, and generally the more complex the system, the more opportunity for frustration and surprises, to use a word that you used earlier. And I think everyone has had these experiences, and they are often very teachable moments. So I ask each of you, what is your horror story, and what did it teach you? Robert, do you want to start?
Well, I'm going to use an example from an observation. So a customer at one time, I won't even say what company I was at when it was a customer, but I have a lot of empathy for this person. There was once an e-commerce site that I was involved with, who the marketing intern was setting up discounting. And I think the marketing intern made a slightly small mistake that ended up in not only discounting the entire catalog by 60%, but also republishing the out of stock catalog. And it was a UK-based e-commerce site. And by the time they had woken up, they had sold an enormous amount of non-existing goods at a steep discount to China. I don't have, there's no like takeaway or moral from that. It's just a funny story.
That is a pretty good one. Betty, what's your horror story?
Well, gosh, I think it's, yeah, I was thinking like a few, but like, but I don't think it's one is just like, avoiding the Friday deployments, I think just reduces a lot of that heartburn, and that's probably something people learn early on. That's probably not a good idea.
Deploy on Friday. Deploy every day. Deploy on Friday.
We have a whole panel about that alone.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and then I guess the other thing, something that's probably more, that I've, I think we've learned the hard way, and especially as we've, to the point of scaling the team is, when it comes to DNS, right? You can imagine with like 100+ sites, we've got a ton of custom domains, a lot of vanity URLs. Peter's holding his head. Oh no. Yeah. I think it's I think one of the worst things that has happened, and I'm sure, I'm assuming it's happened to a lot of people, but it's like, you forget to check and drop to TTL, and meanwhile, everybody else in the world is expecting a site to go live at a specific moment for whatever reason, and those are just hard. Like, there's just no way there's nothing to roll back. There's nothing you're just sitting there. And so, I think that's one of those hard lessons where you're like, you know what, this is where having a checklist with very specific commands and just like being very prescriptive, it helps, like everywhere else, you want to give people flexibility and room to interpret, but not here. This is that's not the moment.
I'll add to Betty's DNS horror that this is also an operational person problem. Many organizations get to the point where they want to go live with a site and then realize that they need a subdomain on their DNS, and they don't know who does that in their organization or how long it'll take. So that's often a checklist item that gets ignored at the operational level as well, not just the technical problem.
Yeah, great point. All right, Peter, do you want to close us out with your horror story?
Yeah, if I must, but Betty's was already quite scary. Well, I mean, I can, let me say it like that. I can confidently tell you what our record is for keeping our website online only through our CDN, with everything behind that failing. And it's 6.5 hours. And I can with confidence say that those were 6.5 hours were all of us learned time and time again what Betty said. There is a certain amount of standardization and protocol and checklists that are definitely valuable, and they're definitely not to be ignored. Even if you have done it like 1,000 times, you just do it because you don't want to have 150 editors writing you emails, calling you on the phone, writing you in Slack, and asking you like, look, there's like 300 articles that stacked up over the last 5 hours. When are they going to be live? And you're like, well, who knows?
Yeah, it's a great point. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing that. And hopefully to anyone in the audience, if you've experienced your own horror story, hopefully this makes you feel slightly less alone. Happens to all of us. But anyway, that concludes the panel for today. So thank you so much to the panelists for all your awesome insights today. We'll be taking questions now on the Lead Dev Slack in the Building Software channel. So please head there to continue the discussion. And thank you for joining. We hope to see you next time.